Now and then, despite being positioned as the ultimate threat, a final boss in a video game may be overshadowed by another foe. I'm Cy for WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 video game enemies better than the final boss. Number 10. Lady Dimitrescu, Resident Evil Village. Resident Evil Village has become one of the fastest selling entries in Capcom's Titan horror franchise, and one particular reason for this is the little case of Alcina Dimitrescu, although perhaps not that little as she stands over 9 foot tall and commands a loyal army of thirsty video gamers. In all fairness, Capcom never really said that Lady D was going to be a major part of Village's campaign, but her instant popularity caused them to really focus on her during the rest of the game's marketing. Many who purchased the title were sad to see her go about a quarter of the way into the title. And in traditional Resi fashion, she didn't stay pretty for long. It's much harder to simp for a gigantic dragon monster, but in a vacuum the boss fight is one of the best spectacles that the series has ever produced. There's nothing at all wrong with the game's final big bad, Mother Miranda, and arguably her battle is the most fun one of the entire game, but her evil scheme doesn't make a ton of sense and her laughing megalomania is a little old hat. Alcina and her daughters, vampiric creatures made of blowflies, were a touch more unique. Number 9. VAAS Montenegro, Far Cry 3. Sometimes a great story has multiple villains to keep you guessing. Far Cry 3 is nothing if not a great story. The game's pair of baddies, VAAS Montenegro and Hoyt Volker, are vastly different characters with their own personal flavours of evil that, combined, give Far Cry 3 a fantastic depth. Still, it's hard not to think that VAAS outshines the game's true big bad. Michael Mando's performance really brought VAAS to life, especially in the lead up to the game's release, where he played the character in live-action vignettes. He was front and centre on the game's box and in-game trailers too, and his loud, bright, unhinged persona was something that gamers were keen to experience. VAAS was the kind of character you wanted to see more of, even if doing so meant chaos for you to deal with as the player. Neither of the game's boss fights are particularly interesting in all fairness, but the showdown with VAAS comes way too early in the story. Hoyt's own brand of evil was more calculated and chilling, which is perfectly fine, but with the removal of VAAS from the plot, Far Cry 3 loses a lot of character. Number 8. KUJA, Final Fantasy IX. There's a storytelling trend in JRPGs for the final battle to be something greater than your original adversary, a god or even a concept or idea made real. In some games it tonally works and it's the grand showdown that feels deserved. In Final Fantasy IX, however, it feels a little bit like it comes out of nowhere. It probably doesn't help that it isn't something that the Final Fantasy series often does. Previous games established a villain and built to a final battle with them to close out the story. FF9's primary antagonist KUJA drives the plot forward with his connections to Zidane, his jealousy, and his dark nihilism. The character's weakness, a seeming inability to go into the game's trance limit break mode, makes it a big deal when he finally enters this superpowered state and the party finally square up to him. But when Zidane and friends overcome what should be the final battle, an unexpected showdown with death itself just feels a little bit tacked on. Final Fantasy IX's whole story is about mortality, so it makes sense that the final battle itself would be with this manifested concept, but that doesn't make it a good idea. There are no hints or warnings for this, and the sudden reveal of Necron only makes it feel like the writers were trying to overshadow the importance of KUJA. Number 7. MANUS, Dark Souls. After an entire game of hardened regular enemies and downright brutal boss fights, Dark Souls' Bed of Chaos just seems like a huge letdown. The fight can either be a downright train wreck that requires you to use very little of what you've learnt, or alternatively you can parry the hell out of it and get through basically unharmed. It's so bad that series director Miyazaki even admitted that he regretted how Bed of Chaos turned out. That should say enough about it. The final battle of Dark Souls is outshined by many others, but when it comes to the cream of the crop, it may well belong to the father of Abyss himself, MANUS. First of all, the game's DLC introduces him by literally dragging the player backwards through time so that they could learn about how deeply connected MANUS is to the lore of the universe. Best described as a DPS race, MANUS's fast, furious and downright ferocious attacks make him one of the most challenging encounters. Thankfully, you can have a little aid from the Wolf Sif if you saved him in the previous room, which makes this battle that little bit more unique. This demonic creature retroactively makes up for the mistakes of Bed of Chaos and should be recognised as the true king of the original Dark Souls. Number 6. Archvile, Doom 2. A bad final boss fight can sometimes totally ruin a gaming experience. Thankfully, Doom 2 is so awesome that this isn't the case, but it's a pretty universally held opinion that Icon of Sin was a lame way to end what had been, up until that point, an action-packed thrill ride. Who wants to end their time fighting off demons with a battle against a wall? Doom 2 introduced us to a few new great enemies, including Archvile. Looking like Slenderman's hardcore grandfather, this demon has a taste for barbecuing Doom Guy and is one of the toughest enemy types in the game. Something really cool about the concept of Archvile is that he's actually considered a healer of the demonic horde. Despite the fact that his jets of fire can damage and even kill his fellow soldiers, he will go around the battlefield reviving them afterwards. This is, according to sound designer Bobby Prince, the reason that Archvile screams "why" when they die. Why would anyone want to hurt a healer? Marty Stratton, the producer of Doom Eternal, said that it was one of his favourite demons from the original franchise, which was almost certainly a factor in Archvile's return, complete with a prominent place in the original reveal trailer. Number 5. The Hammer of Sauron, Middle-earth, Shadow of Mordor. Shadow of Mordor's revenge-driven hero Talion finds himself clashing with Sauron's 3 black captains over the course of the game. 2 of these are actually pretty rubbish, but even that aside, the Hammer of Sauron triumphs as an awesome boss fight. The combination of everything in this fight just feels epic. Talion calling the hammer out to kick things off, the high energy music, and our foe standing back watching us deal with his goons, waiting to strike. Several of Shadow of Mordor's biggest threats felt imposing and like legitimate leaders, but none more so than the hammer. Considering he represented Sauron's military prowess, it only made sense. This was in stark contrast to the final fight in Shadow of Mordor, which sadly amounted to nothing more than a quick-time event. Facing off with the Black Hand of Sauron is an incredibly boring thing. It's barely a boss fight at all, which means the game ends with a bit of a whimper. Considering that Shadow of Mordor's strength was in its Nemesis system, which greatly impacted enemy AI depending on player action, it seemed like a mistrick not to use your entire campaign's worth of results to shape this final battle. Number 4. Star Wolf, Star Fox 64. Many great mascot heroes in gaming have rivals that are essentially their darker alter ego, and the proud heroic Fox McCloud is no different. The majority of boss fights in Star Fox 64 are against huge machines, ships and stations that can be imposing but are certainly all big lumbering targets. The same can be said for the series' big bad Andros, a huge floating head. The fight is a sort of space battle version of David and Goliath, with your tiny ship blasting away at the gigantic floating Planet of the Apes reject. It feels suitably climactic, but it's not the best fight in the game. The fight that stands out the most is the clash against Wolf O'Donnell and his buddies, so incensed by the righteousness of Fox McCloud and company that they've decided to call themselves Star Wolf. In a wide open area that can differ depending on which route you take, you are then challenged to take down 4 enemies just like yourself. It's a truly different kind of battle to the majority of the game, and with Star Wolf's suitably epic theme music feels like a real push and pull of 2 teams. Taking down hulking space stations has its place, and the fact that it allows this battle to feel so different is what makes it special, because an actual R-Wing dogfight is much more exciting. Number 3. Gabriel Roman, Uncharted, Drake's Fortune. This is a rare example of an enemy on this list that players never got the chance to fight, but they absolutely should have. Gabriel Roman is introduced to Uncharted in a way that offers a little more world building to the universe. A former associate of Sully's who does not suffer fools, going so far as to shoot Nate's mentor in the first scene he's in. You know he's not messing around, and from then on players assume that it's all leading to some kind of face-off with the man. The turn doesn't exactly come out of nowhere, as Roman has spent Uncharted treating his right-hand hired gun Navarro like dirt. The mercenary, whose entire personality amounts to wanting to get to the fabled El Dorado artifact, tricks Roman into becoming a twisted monster and then shoots him dead. Navarro then becomes the game's final boss and, well, he's just not nearly as interesting. Both in screen time and performance, Navarro can't stack up to Roman's charismatic, suitably British evil act. At least this twist is very late into Uncharted's story, but it does feel a little bit like players were robbed of a great showdown with Gabriel Roman. Number 2. Big Daddy, BIOSHOCK. About 3/4 of the way into BIOSHOCK, your compatriot Atlas uncloaks himself to be Frank Fontaine, a moustache-twirling, scene-chewing kind of pantomime villain who sounds like every stereotypical mob boss ever. The final showdown with him is incredibly easy, boring, and unfortunately is a huge step down considering the potential of that infamous plot twist. Thankfully, BIOSHOCK does not rely on the strength of its lead bad guy to get by, and instead the game is all about the Big Daddies. After all, they're so good they take up the entire box art and are largely considered one of the most iconic game designs of the 2000s. What makes the Big Daddy such a great enemy is, strangely, the ability to avoid them. You can totally skirt around them if you want to, but it's so much more you're worth taking the fight to them. After all, they protect the little sisters, who are your entry to some pretty great rewards. Stomping around the giant, empty and destroyed hallways of Rapture, the Big Daddy cut an imposing figure that they back up in combat. Whether they're outfitted with the massive shotgun or the gigantic drill, the Big Daddies are guaranteed to produce some of the most memorable moments of any BioShock playthrough. Number 1. Guardian Stalker, Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild. Sometimes Breath of the Wild could be a really relaxing jaunt through post-war Hyrule. Then, you hear that piano jingling in the distance? Well, that's the sound of your doom approaching. First of all, any enemy that has a signature sound is going to stick out to you, but the Guardians in Breath of the Wild really did their best to make sure you couldn't forget them. The spidering, unfeeling bringers of laser-based pain were sprinkled over the plains of Hyrule to keep you on your toes, and inspired every one of us to run screaming into the hills to avoid them. When it comes to facing the final boss of the game, it's open to take on at any time. This means you can rock up early and get Link splattered across the throne room instantly if you so wish. Most players, however, will rinse the rest of the game and go in fully outfitted, equipped and ready for a showdown, which will be, at this late stage in your journey, possibly rather unfulfilling. If you've spent the sufficient amount of time exploring Breath of the Wild, it doesn't take much to be ready to outpace Calamity Ganon. However, on the way up to that final showdown through the ruins of Hyrule Castle, you can be absolutely sure that you're still avoiding Guardians every step of the way. Says a lot, don't you think? And that's the list. Let us know what you thought of this video down in the comments below, and any other video game enemies that you can think of that stand out to you more than the game's final boss. Make sure you like this video, share it with your friends, subscribe, hit that notification bell. I've been Cy for WhatCulture.com, and have a good week.